Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Robert Owens with Craft Education, and I'm excited to have you join us for today's webinar, Understanding Workforce Pell for Talent Pipelines. For millions of Americans, the traditional 2 to 4 year degree isn't the only path to a good career. Short-term workforce training in fields like IT, healthcare, advanced manufacturing, and clean energy can lead to family-sustaining wages in months, not years. But too often, the biggest barrier isn't skills or motivation, it's paying for the program. That's where this conversation around workforce Pell Grants come in. You may know Pell as the foundational grant for college students, but what if Pell could also follow learners into high quality, short term workforce programs? What if financial aid could also catch up to the way people actually build careers around today? Over the next 60 minutes, we're going to unpack exactly what we'll cover, framing what Workforce Pell is and why it matters, institutional readiness, program design, eligibility, and compliance, scaling Workforce Pell, systems, infrastructure, and coordination, and lastly, preparing for Workforce Pell success. Now, at the end, we are going to leave some time for Q&A, so please feel free to submit your questions through our webinar using our chat or our Q&A box. To help frame today's discussion, I would like to invite each of our panelists to briefly introduce themselves. First, we'll start with Rafael, Wesley, and then Bill.
Thanks, Robert. Hi, everyone. My name is Rafael Castañeda. I'm representing Kaplan Education and the Enterprise Learning Solutions team. I work with employers, academic institutions, workforce entities, and other stakeholders, essentially to create pathways for learners to go from where they are to where they want to go in life, using education as a vehicle. I think it's exciting because we're seeing workforce as kind of a top of inbox strategy for institutions and workforce stakeholders in today's landscape, which I think is incredibly significant because it requires a complete rethink and redesign of the whole ecosystem and the commitment that it's going to take to make that happen. So excited to be here today and appreciate the time. Thanks.
All right, Wesley.
Hi, I'm Wesley Whistle with New America. I'm the project director for student success and affordability. I do a lot of work on higher education policy across, federal, state, institutional, and really across the spectrum. I'm also the author of the Substack Workforce Pell Watch. So if you've been following that, I've been trying to track all the developments with Workforce Pell.
All right, and lastly, Bill.
Hi, everybody. So glad to see you all here. I'm Bill McKinney. I am with TPMA, which is short for Thomas P. Miller Associates. We are a medium-sized consulting firm working in the workforce education nexus, that space, as it were. We're headquartered in Indianapolis, but are really a virtual organization with team members in 16 different states. We work all over the country. And I serve as a senior partnership advisor. So as you might imagine, I get to work with higher education institutions, workforce boards, chambers of commerce, standalone employers, trying to find those areas where educators and employers can best work together. I am kind of a living, breathing example of an answer to the question, what does someone do when they began their career as a classroom professor, was a college dean, was a provost, was a president, worked in a university system? You consult. And I'm delighted to be here with all of you today, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. Thanks, Robert.
All right, thank you everyone for the introductions. I'd like to now turn it over to Wesley to provide an overview of Workforce Pell and to help frame today's discussion. Wesley, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. All right, we can go to the next slide. I think that it's important to understand, why we're talking about this, why this new funding has come about. I think a lot of folks have been wanting, more federal investment in job training and workforce training. And so Pell became a very appealing place for folks. It's much larger than our existing workforce training funds. It's predominantly an entitlement program. And so, that funding is there and it's growing with demand. Obviously, like I said, WIOA training funds are limited, and non-credit workforce programs are often more nimble and employer driven. And so this became an appealing way, and it's been there's been advocacy for this bill for I think, more than a decade, and it, finally passed last year in HR 1. We can go to the next slide. So I think it's good to also understand the history around this, and so why these limitations on short-term programs have existed. Um, there's been a long-standing question around whether federal student aid should support short-term job training programs, and I can say, like, there's a CRS report, Congressional Research Service report, from the day after I was born that asks the question is, should federal student aid cover these kinds of programs? There's been many decades of issues around this, though, in federal student aid, where we had, fraud and abuse, really poor job outcomes, and really high student loan default rates, where, predominantly in the for-profit college space, where you had, lots of bad behavior. Again, some of it was just fraudulent, some of it was just really poor training, and so it didn't lead to those kinds of outcomes. So, in 1992, the federal government, sorry, my dog, they set this limit saying that for 600 clock hour minimum for Pell Grants, and only provided some loan programs for short-term job training programs. All right, we can go to the next one. So just some basics here. To receive this, it's students have to fill out the FAFSA and be eligible for that. It excludes folks with who have a graduate degree. It does not exclude them who have a bachelor's degree, which is not how Pell traditionally operates. But the funds here are counted for a student's lifetime limit on Pell. The other thing I think that is important to understand is the amount of money that it is. A lot of folks, hear that the maximum federal student or Pell Grant grant amount is $7,395, but that is prorated based on two things: length and student financial need. So, here, like, if we're talking about an 8-week program, the actual amount of money can be pretty small, and I think it's really important for people to understand that. So, the minimum award for someone who just qualifies for the minimum amount is only $125, where the maximum is, if you're a full Pell student, you would only get, a little over $1,200 for, the program. All right, next slide. So to be an eligible program, it has to operate providing 150 to 599 clock hours, or the equivalent for credit hours, over 8 to 14 weeks in duration. These programs have to be in operation for at least a year before the secretary can approve them. And I think a lot of folks have missed this too. It has to be an accredited institution, a Title IV eligible institution. It cannot be, an unaccredited program. It can't be a correspondence program, but distance education programs are allowed. Next slide. Okay, so these programs are approved in a TBD process by each governor. I know states are working on these actively. I'm doing a lot of work on technical assistance with states. I've talked to probably 30 or so states, and they're all at different stages. The rule just became final yesterday. So, there's kind of a short ramp here for states. And so they've been trying to figure this out, while waiting for the final rule to see what, the parameters they have are. So in that process, the governors will determine, what occupations or industries are high wage, high skill, or, these in-demand industry sectors, that these programs will meet employer hiring requirements. And it has to lead to a recognized, stackable, and portable credential. So it has to, it has to go across more than one employer. It can't be just a specialized training program for one employer. And also has to be for academic credit. It has to end up in academic credit. So when a student is in a non-credit program, a clock hour program that isn't for credit, when they, if they decide to continue their education, they have to be able to receive credit towards a related certificate or degree. And it needs to, not just like electives or general education requirements. It has to be for those program requirements. So there's some important accountability metrics here. These programs have to show a 70% completion rate, a 70% within 150% of program time. 70% job placement within 180 days. In the first 3 years, that is, I think, a much more relaxed definition. In that, in 3 years out, that will start to have to be, states need to be using like enhanced wage records to see are they placed in the occupation or industry for which those students trained. There's also what they call the value-added earnings requirement. Essentially, it's saying that whatever you pay, you have to earn at least $1 more than that above the federal poverty line of 150%. It's kind of a strange thing. It's actually the earnings are measured 1 year after completion, but then the calculation is based on the tuition 3 years after the student enrolls. So at that time, and then the way the department has structured the rule is that, you know, if a program fails that, then the program has to return those Pell dollars to the department. And to continue, maintain their eligibility, they have to have their tuition lowered to satisfy this requirement. Next one. So yeah, here's just a little more detail. The states are going to have to calculate both completion and job placement. Completion is fairly straightforward. Placement will be harder, like I said, with those enhanced wage records because many states don't have that right now. And so a lot of states need to be thinking about how they can set up that infrastructure and talk to their employers to make sure that they are getting those data from their, UI wage records. The Department of Education will do the calculation on the value-added earnings. They will be, working with IRS to get those tax records like they have done for the college scorecard, for gainful employment. Yeah, next slide. And here's just some, we've seen some types of programs that might be eligible based on existing, there's existing programs, there's existing state funding first in some places, clinical medical assistant, phlebotomy tech, EMT, welding, CDL. But those are just, some of the, I think the more common ones that I think we'll see. But of course, it varies across states and everything too. Like CDL, I'm in Kentucky, CDL programs are way too short, so they actually won't qualify. But these are just some of the common ones. And then, well, questions at the end, I guess. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much. Again, we will leave time at the end to ask any questions. So please, again, feel free to put them into the chat box. So thank you so much, Wesley, for that overview, which provides a good foundation for the rest of our discussion. So now I'd like to bring in the other panelists to join us for a roundtable discussions. So first, I'd like to bring you in, Rafael. I wanted to ask you what types of institutions or programs are best positioned to benefit early from Workforce Pell implementation?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think Wesley kind of touched on those in the latter part of the presentation there. But just kind of going back a step, from my perspective, like anything in life, the institution's with a plan, right? Like it's not just about awareness for this; it's what is your plan to actually approach this new ecosystem. Because there's so many moving parts from the beginning of the student's journey all the way to the end that are going to be vastly different than what you have currently been doing. So, I also want to underscore that there's a pretty strong belief that I have that this isn't just about academic program design, but it's also about building, enhancing, and leveraging the underlying infrastructure to support that whole ecosystem. So to be very, specific, I would say institutions with executive leadership buy-in and commitment to this in the first place. Those with existing and strong employer workforce relationships, those with existing short-term workforce programs, like those are the examples that were given earlier. Those with nimble regulatory teams, because one thing that is mentioned is there's no reciprocity here, so you kind of have to go state by state, which is going to require quite a bit of lift. Robust outcomes reporting infrastructures. This is like nothing we've seen before in terms of outcomes reporting, and it has to be pretty much bulletproof to maintain this access. And then I would say also the academic analysis and construction ecosystems, those are going to be really, really important for the institutions to have. So I would say obviously community colleges are naturally well positioned because I think they do this, kind of every day. But universities with workforce divisions or maybe those with strong training provider partnerships might have some significant opportunity. But I think those that are specifically in the healthcare, specifically allied health, IT skilled trades, I think they're going to move the fastest and the quickest because there's already employer signal demands for those types of jobs and roles. And so if you have those types of programs, those are going to be the ones that I think are going to be the most in demand and be able to move that the fastest. But kind of going back to it, this is a workforce system. This is not a design new programs and then go launch them into the marketplace. This is not about marketing. This is about an entire ecosystem build. So I think those institutions with a plan from the beginning, starting with analysis of what you have and then how do you approach that, are going to be the ones that are going to be the most successful long term.
All right. Thank you so much, Rafael, for helping us understand which institutions may be best positioned early on. Now, building upon that, let's talk about the broader opportunities Workforce Pell could create for institutions looking to strengthen their workforce pathways. So, Bill, I'd like to bring you in. Bill, what practical opportunities could Workforce Pell create for institutions building stronger workforce pathways?
Sure. And Rafael, I could not have asked for a better lead-in to this particular question. As I sit back and I take this all in and take a look at where we are right now, that ecosystemic approach to workforce and education, I think for me is really where the greatest practical opportunity lies. Workforce Pell really requires a kind of robust cooperation and collaboration between employers and educators. And again, as Raphael just seriously pointed out, and he's absolutely right, this has really been the stock and trade of many community and technical colleges over the years. That's why these institutions exist. That's not to say that in the four-year sector, those kinds of relationships don't exist. And in fact, I think one of the more notable places where they exist are in many professional programs. What I think you're going to have to see, regardless of the sector, whether it's the two-year sector, whether it's the four-year sector, public or private, it doesn't really matter. I think you're going to have to see an enhanced role. If I'm putting myself back in my old role as a chief academic officer, I am going to need to have very robust advisory councils in these professions so that I can make sure that the academic programs on my campus are properly aligned. Presidents have done this for decades. They have had advisory councils to a greater or lesser extent. A lot of it is often for fundraising. A lot do take it seriously as advice. Many, however, have really taken it the step further to have a kind of reciprocity, to have a kind of give and take, to make sure that the higher ed institution is still relevant to the needs of the locality, the region, whatever have you. As I mentioned, a lot of professional programs have had these for decades, and heck, many of them have to have them for accreditation. You see this in technical disciplines, you see this in healthcare. Workforce Pell, in really locking in and focusing on the fact that these programs not only have to be relevant and applicable to high demand jobs in a particular state, but at the same time, the higher ed institution is going to have to make sure that these workforce credentials are then stackable into a two-year degree, a four-year degree, and maybe even beyond. So for me, yeah, it sounds like a challenge, but it's an opportunity that I would be ready to roll up my sleeves and tackle.
All right. Thank you so much, Bill. I do see we getting a lot of questions, and we are going to try to make sure we leave time at the end to answer as many questions as we can. Now, Bill, those are great examples. Now, as institutions begin to think strategically about implementation, many are also asking what internal changes they could start to implement the program now. So I'd like to come back to you, Rafael. What are the most important program design or operational changes institutions should begin evaluating right now?
And again, another great question, because I think the first question even before that is like, do you even want to participate in this space? Right? Like that's question number one, I think, for any institution. And that answer should be like yes or no. because it's not a half in, half out scenario. It's a very prescriptive process. It's actually quite detailed in terms of what is required. So, if the answer is yes, great. Let's move forward with something like immediate program viability. So an assessment on your current catalog. What do you currently have that could theoretically meet these thresholds? That gives you an opportunity to say, this is what we currently have. And then immediately moving into the where, right? But most, kind of going back to the academic programs, is most of those degree-based types of catalogs, they're not necessarily built with like short-term workforce delivery modeling in mind. A lot of these types of programs are going to have some sort of clinical requirement as a part of a licensure or a certification or completion or graduation component. So not a lot of those catalogs have that type of design associated with them. Many do. Not all of them are going to. So you want to do that immediate assessment to say, what do we currently have? And then where might those gaps be? Which then gives you the opportunity to go into the geographical question of where are we going to deploy these? Because that then is the demand signaling with your employer partners, if you have them. Because if you don't have them, then that is going to be a challenge in terms of how you're going to get this 70%, placement rate. So it really is a reverse engineer from the perspective of, do we want to do this? Because if you do, it's going to take that whole institution commitment, number one, because you're talking about the ecosystem that sits across the entirety of the institution and possibly even beyond that into partnerships like employers, right? So it's going to take a whole commitment, but the good news is that it's prescriptive. So you're able to go, this is what we have to do. And you put together a playbook and you put together a strategy and you go and you do that. So I think that the program design or operational changes can be done, but it definitely is a first question is like, do we even want to do this? Because it is going to take some pain and suffering to get there for many institutions, but I think it can be done for those that do want to do it and do it well.
All right, thank you, Rafael. Now you highlighted several important operational considerations. Now I want to bring you in, Wesley. Now, to ask you, as institutions begin redesigning programs and systems, compliance and reporting requirements are becoming a more topic of discussion. What new compliance or reporting demands are likely to create the biggest challenge for institutions?
Actually, I think for institutions, the reporting piece isn't actually that big of a lift for them. It's actually very similar to how they've done other things. I mean, not just, gainful employment as one perfect example where many, community colleges have already been doing this for their existing certificate programs. But that they're just reporting student level data to the state and to the department through, whatever state function they normally have, or an SLDS to the federal government, which is usually for most schools, I think, is through the National Student Clearinghouse. That part's not that hard. I think the infrastructure side is that, like, on the state side, like I mentioned with the enhanced wage records. I think the biggest challenge for schools here is going to be, we've heard for decades how community colleges, the non-credit and the credit sides of the house, do not talk to each other that much, or they're not integrated. So breaking down those silos and working together to make sure, again, that it articulates into a related degree or certificate. And I think that's the challenge, but it's a real opportunity, I think, for enrollment management purposes, but also just, better alignment across those areas to where, if a student goes into this, non-credit program, gets Workforce Pell, then they can either go get a job, hopefully a very good paying job, but also if they want to go for that longer credential that, they got a taste for the academic program and the training, and they want to, try to get the longer certificate or the degree in advanced manufacturing, or, that can really open the doors for them, again, for enrollment management for the schools to help them with, revenue and recruitment, but also, end up with students having an even better job and more stability, long term.
All right, thank you, Wesley. Now, beyond compliance, other critical issues institutions are navigating is ensuring that these programs remain closely connected to employer demand and labor market realities. So, Bill, I'd like to bring you in to ask you, how can institutions ensure their programs are fully aligned with employer demand and workforce realities?
Thanks, Robert. To go back and echo something that Wesley just addressed, and that is the breaking down of silos within an institution. Very often, if you've got an institution that has or offers workforce credentials. And if those workforce credentials are not on the credit bearing side of the house, right, you've instantly got a silo. You've got silos in place between the non-credit bearing side and the credit bearing side. Now, conversations that I have had with a lot of states over the last several years, a lot of states are trying to break down those distinctions. And in fact, you've had a lot of community college systems, larger community college systems all over the country, that as they have been developing their workforce credentials, they're building that they've I don't know if they anticipated this or what. They built those credentials on a credit bearing chassis, more or less, to kind of use a manufacturing metaphor there. So communication between these parts of the institution that very often have not communicated with each other is absolutely critical. That's a leadership challenge. That's a challenge for chief academic officers, but at the same time, for my colleagues in higher ed institutions, do not, please, I beg you, do not leave your faculty out of these conversations, because they are the ones who design the curricula. You have got to get them involved very early on in these conversations, because at a lot of institutions, they're also the ones who have the closer relationships with the employers. And so making sure that those kinds of constructive dialogues exist from the outset can make things a lot easier if, as Rafael pointed out, you decide, yes, we're going to go down this road. Yeah, it's a heavy lift, make no mistake about that, but I think it can be worth it if you're willing to break down those silos and have that conversation.
All right. Thank you so much, Bill. Because alignment with employers is clearly essential, saying for program success. However, we know collaboration across multiple stakeholders can sometimes be challenging, so that is very, very important. Want to stay with you, Bill, where do institutions most commonly struggle with when coordinating across employers, workforce boards, and internal systems?
It's culture. It's institutional inertia, more or less. Higher ed institutions in the United States, and I'm gonna talk about four-year institutions right now. That's actually from where I have most of my professional experience. They weren't built for this, right? They come from an agrarian model in the 19th century, built on a German model of higher education, coming from a monastic structure in the Middle Ages. This is not what higher ed was built to do. At the same time, higher ed institutions have come to recognize over the last decade or more the need to be more nimble, the need to be more innovative, the need to be more responsive. Part of that is driven by competition. There is more competition in the market right now for students than anyone could have ever imagined a decade, 2 decades ago. That competition comes from 2-year institutions that are offering 4-year degrees. It comes from online institutions. What Workforce Pell offers in terms of an opportunity is a chance to adapt and adjust, and in the case of many institutions, to thrive. And so I like to think of this more in terms of an opportunity, but for me, looking at this from the outside, I think where many institutions struggle with this is the fact that, by and large, they weren't designed to do this. But many more are realizing, you know what, if we're going to thrive in the environment they're in right now, we need to adapt. So
Right.
that's my take.
All right. Thank you so much. Because Bill, those coordination challenges are important to recognize. Raphael, many institutions are also concerned about the operational and system level barriers that come with integrating short-term and non-credit programs into existing infrastructure. I know we kind of talked about it earlier, but what operational or system barriers should institutions anticipate when integrating short-term or non-credit program into existing infrastructures?
Yeah, I think it's a good long list for sure, and I think that my colleagues have done a good job about highlighting a few of them. A few more that I think you should definitely put on the list are programmatic gap analysis that's timely and affordable. And this might actually be one of the places where AI can actually help and create some jobs, because that can actually speed that analysis up. It can actually show where content can be built quickly. And it's an opportunity to actually do that in a faster cadence than you would normally do if it were to be done manually. I think building and gaining approval and deploying new workforce programs at speed and scale, right? There's nothing you can really do to speed the regulatory process. So that's something else you need to be aware of. Student information system limitations, that's going to be an issue. Financial aid integration challenges. It was mentioned earlier, but if you've worked on a campus, this is absolutely true. Disconnects between credit and non-credit systems. Sometimes the credit side of the house doesn't even know where the non-credit side of the house is on campus. So that is a challenge. Employer coordination complexity. If you don't have that existing, ecosystem built, that can be a bit of a challenge, obviously. To a lesser extent, I suppose, but certainly I think it's still a challenge is outcome tracking or reporting limitations. If you don't have that ecosystem in place, that can be a challenge. It's very different than not responding to your alumni postcard. This is not that. This is something very, very different than that. So, that's going to be a challenge. And then if you have current or potential training provider partners that you're currently working with that do a lot of this work for you, how does that ecosystem look as well? So, I mean, the list is long, but the good news is that if you're working through this and you have that plan, you have that commitment for the institution, I think Bill said this well, it is an opportunity to tap into something because these jobs are in demand. Students are showing the proclivity that they want them. The government is willing to subsidize them. I think this is an opportunity for all groups to kind of come together and actually do and build workforce ecosystems together. So if you have your list of challenges and you tick them off quickly, and you build through them, I think this is a great opportunity for those institutions that know there's challenges, but you work through them like you would with any other challenge list that you have.
All right, thank you so much, Rafael. As we look ahead, it's clear that there are both significant opportunities and complex operational considerations. Wesley, what are the major implementation risks or policy blind spots should institutional leaders be paid attention to as workforce spells continue to evolve?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest part is just on the articulation and making sure that actually happens. I think the best way to do that is to build it from the beginning, doing so. And, every state again is going to have a different policy on what that requirement is, that the regulations require that that there's a policy that, states have some written agreement or transfer, articulation agreement or something that shows that that students will get credit for these programs into the related degree or certificate. I think, all the things Bill was talking about and when I was one of the silos, it's, designing these up front and making it, fully mapping it. I think and communicating that to students from the very beginning, right? Saying this is the Workforce Pell Program. It leads to this job and it also gives you this credit for this program. And ideally, if there's multiple options, that would be, I think that's the best way to do it to serve both the institution and the student. Um, I think that's the biggest, operational challenge. I think, you know, every state is again different across the board on these policies. Some of them are setting higher bars and they're being strategic about how to meet their state and workforce needs. Some are not. There's some legislatures that were saying high wage means 150% of the federal poverty line, which is not that. I think there's just going to be different challenges. I know, like you were asking, well, earlier talking about employer engagement. I think it was Maryland and their proposed policy has said that, when a program applies to the state, it has to have documentation from 3 employers validating that their curriculum meets their, what their needs are. So, depending on how the states do that, I think that's going to be the other operational, I think, challenges. Though, to be clear, I think if that kind of work, that more, which I'm not saying that is this, but like an authentic engagement with employers is good for everybody, right? Like that will lead to better programs and better outcomes for the students in the schools. But just trying to understand that piece, as states are developing these policies, and also they have to, change this. Like this is going to be an iterative process, I think, and some states are taking this from a very much a pilot approach. But even still, they have to review their, in their definitions for high skill, high wage, and in demand every at least 2 years. So, being responsive to the economic needs and things is a good thing, but it's gonna, of course, institutions have to be, cognizant of that.
All right, thank you, Wesley, for outlining some of the key risks and policy considerations institutions should be watching out for as workforce Pell evolves. Now, to close out this discussion, I would like to shift into more of a quick rapid fire round with all of our panelists. So I'll start with you first, Bill. In one sentence or briefly thought, if you were advising a college beginning workforce Pell today, what would be a single most important first step?
You need one person who wakes up every morning thinking about how to implement Workforce Pell. They're not on an island. They may have a committee of people with whom they work, but there needs to be one person who is in a decision-making line of authority who wakes up every morning, not only thinking about the how to implement Workforce Pell, but what the implications are for your students. That would be my single biggest piece of advice.
All right, thank you, Rafael.
I completely echo that, and I would say also, that it translates into the commitment that the institution has. I mean, even if you're starting with like a single program, you don't have to like redo your entire, catalog of programs. You can say like, we're going to start with surgical tech, because it's in demand in our state. Like, but it's commitment and it's that champion. It's starting with a workforce Pell readiness audit. That's the first thing you would always do is like, where are we? And are we going to do this? Yes or no? Like you would make any life decision, right? It's very important to do that. And then you partner to build that ecosystem and you have, a consultant or a specialist, somebody come in and help you do this if that knowledge is not native to your institution, right? It's smart, thoughtful thinking about how to do this the right way from the beginning. And then you put together your plan and you go get it done with that person who wakes up every day thinking about it and has the authority to move the needle.
All right, Wesley.
I'd say plus one to all of that. I mean, I've been working with institutions and doing some consulting with them on trying to help them. And I think, one of the challenges I've seen is that they want, let's go for as many programs as possible. We want to do it. And then it kind of becomes a frustrating piece. And I think, schools and states don't have to have a bunch of programs the first year for this to be successful. And I think like the ones who are being the most thoughtful are not taking that approach. And I think they're going to be the ones that are going to be the most successful in, providing good programs that have great outcomes for students and good institutional outcomes. I think that, having like all the things that Bill and Raphael said, like one person who's like in charge pushing this through, but doing it in a very strategic way. And, thinking about how it fits into other state funding sources and other, strategic priorities at your institution. I think that's key.
All right, thank you so much, you all. Really appreciate your insight. Now we're going to open up the floor for questions. We've getting a lot of questions, so we're going to try to answer as many as we can. But again, please feel free to submit your questions using our chat or QA box. So we get a lot of questions around how to tie apprenticeships to these dollars, like what meets these thresholds and accreditation curriculum, like what need to be connected to a college offering credit for programs. Will the registered apprenticeship journey workers certificate count as a credential? And are continuing education courses are qualified? So I'll toss it to you, Wesley, to see if you will have some insight on like how can we tie these apprenticeship dollars to meet these thresholds like accreditation curriculum and so forth.
So the regulations, they tried to make registered apprenticeships fit into this. I will say, but generally speaking, I mean, I love registered apprenticeships. I would tell most people to make them for credit and to go for full Pell eligibility because most programs are too long and it's to do this right is going to be hard. So, but the regulations do say if it's a registered apprenticeship, it automatically meets the definition of high skill, high wage, or in demand. And the employer engagement piece. However, the related technical instruction component can receive under this. It can receive Workforce Pell for just that part. If it meets the hour requirements, if it's provided by an accredited institution, though they can outsource up to 50% of that instruction to an ineligible institution. but that part alone has to lead to a recognized post-secondary credential. So it's confusing because in the regulations, a recognized post-secondary credential can be an apprenticeship completion certificate, but that's not for the RTI only. That's for the whole thing. So it has to be just for the instruction only. They also have to meet the completion requirements of 70% and the job placement, which I don't think that's actually that hard. And, most of them, even if they don't complete the registered apprenticeship, they're probably going to be okay on those, because if it's an 8-week program, 70% completion is not that hard. And job placement, they're likely going to be okay. The value added earnings piece, they're also likely, I think, to be okay. The other piece I would add too is that, a lot of registered apprenticeship programs do not charge tuition. You have to charge tuition, and you have to charge tuition to anyone, no matter if they receive Workforce Pell or not, because that is, part of the rules for Title IV federal student aid. Schools can get into some big trouble if they start doing other things. There's a community college recently closed because they did something similar. So yeah, that's the key thing. But we've had lots of conversations with folks. I love these programs, but I think if you've got a long registered apprenticeship program, think about making it for credit, because I think you actually can get much more for your students than Workforce Pell can give you.
All right. Thank you, Wesley. Rafael, we'll come to you. We got a question that asks, how would you add these funds into pathways for allied health roles? Like, what type of organization could work together to pull them off?
For allied health roles,
Yeah.
well, I think healthcare is probably going to be one of the earliest large scale proving grounds for Workforce Pell, because in this particular industry, these shortages are measurable, urgent, and in just about every role in healthcare, everything requires a industry recognized certification to work in that role. And most of these are going to be in that kind of time frame of what a Workforce Pell Grant would be eligible to fund. I think the challenge is going to be in certain cases, like, does the institution offer these? Because again, in many cases, most of the schools might offer them as like an applied associate's degree, which would be, say, like a 24-month type of program, which this would not be relevant for, because you could just use regular Title IV funding for that. So I think it's going to kind of go back to, does the institution want to offer a new type of catalog certification type programming as opposed to, say, like applied associate's degrees? Then I think that could be a very interesting and amazing opportunity for the right institution that wants to do that, or if they want to partner with an employer where that's a combination of training and then deployability into the clinical opportunities that are done on site with that employer. I think those models are very, very successful. So I think healthcare is actually going to be where this gets proved out very quickly. But I think you're also going to see this in similar industries like manufacturing, where you do also have an in-person component to the education, HVAC, plumbing, electrical, et cetera. I think those are going to be very, very quickly scaled up into this as well. But healthcare, I think, is going to be the one that kind of leads the way, simply because most jobs in that space require some level of license or certification to actually do that role. So it's going to be interesting to see, but I definitely think healthcare is going to be a place where we're going to see a lot of chips being laid.
All right. Thank you so much. So, Bill, I have a question for you. A big hurdle will be getting these programs approved by state workforce boards and the governors. For employers and workforce boards, do they reach out to higher education partners first, or where do they start?
If I were in that kind of position, I would reach out to your higher ed partners first, because obviously those are the places that are going to be bringing in the students, distributing the Workforce Pell dollars. You have to demonstrate that you are in partnership before you would be then seeking approval through the state, whether through the governor's office or whatever have you. So I would want to make very, very sure that my working relationship was set and solid, so that when you go to start working through your state level approvals, you have all your ducks in a row at that point. And besides, through that kind of collaboration, you can make sure that you have everything lined up so that the compliance piece is in place. One of the things I have found in a lot of conversations in a lot of states is one of the challenges is the lack of interoperability between different data systems. And sometimes that has really posed a challenge in building those relational ties between employers and educators. So really making sure that you've locked those relationships in, I think can go a long way toward facilitating this kind of process.
All right, thank you so much. So Wesley, I want to come to you right quick to ask you, like, these rules are all new. We just seen that it just dropped yesterday, some new updates. Are there any risk that will keep changes over the next 2 years? If yes, what should organizations do against it?
Uh, excuse me. I mean, I think that, the the big changes we're going to see is going to be at the state level, and again, it's just everywhere is going to be different. I mean, depending on the state, some states the workforce board is running the process, and others it's the state higher education agency. Most of them are doing it as they have a working group, a task force. I've dealt with many of them that have lots of different kinds of folks at the table. So I think that there's, what we're going to see is just, I think in some states, very much that pilot process of, going through. I think, you know, the big piece of confusion right now across the board is, I think there's a lot of folks who are ineligible institutions who think that they can be eligible and they won't be. And I think that's the biggest gap right now, where it's, you have to be an institution that can receive federal student aid to be eligible. That's, I think, the biggest gap right now.
All right, thank you. So, Bill, I'd like to come to you right quick. Can short allied healthcare certifications like 20 to 12 to 20 weeks qualify for workforce Pels, excuse me, or has it been an associate's type of degree?
Oh, if those kinds of credentials are, right now built on a credit hour system, then sure, by all means. And to go back to what Rafael had addressed earlier, I think the best test case for how Workforce Pell is going to roll out is in the healthcare disciplines. There's no question about it. You see it in every single state. You see the need for these. You see the need for these occupations, the need to get good qualified people into them. And the best part of it is, at least from where I sit, the relationships are there between higher ed institutions and the healthcare providers, because you need these students need to have their practica, right? They need to be actually there on the floor doing the work, working with professionals in the field. So yes, I think by all means you will see this being the case.
All right. Now, Raphael, can I ask you a quick question that we got in? Does operating timelines requirements, example like 1 year, apply to programs specifically or for institutions?
So I saw that question. And I believe that that's programmatic. So I would kind of rely on Wesley because I think he's more of the regulatory person on this one. But my understanding is it's the program itself has to be offered for a year prior to that. Now the floodgates open to I mean, I don't think we'll see a flood, but July 1st of this year is going to be when this kind of goes live, right? And I think that that year rule kind of goes into play at that point, because it has to be an established program. It can't just be like, we've never done this before. We don't have anything related to it. We have zero ecosystem to support students, but we want to go ahead and tap into funding. So it is a programmatic offering that has to be in place for that year. The institution itself has obviously been around, but we would assume for longer than that.
Yeah, I'll just add, it is a programmatic requirement. The program has to be in existence. The program also has to meet the requirements for the past year. So you can't have a program that was, 6 weeks and then all of a sudden you try to make it 8 weeks and that is eligible. That, would start the clock over. And similarly, has to have 70% completion, 70% job placement, and governors are supposed to, basically look when they, at that published tuition and fees and earnings outcomes from the programs to basically take that, is this going to pass the value added earnings?
And Wesley, if I can stay with you, we have a question that asks, we have several programs that meet the high wage, high roll criteria, but do not match the hours, weeks indicated. How was this determined, and is there any flexibility in this?
There is no flexibility. That's in the law. It's a very very strict piece that was just put into the law.
Okay. And Bill, want to come to you. We have a question about the visibility for students. How do students learn what programs are eligible for Workforce Pell?
This is a great question because this is an issue that I have seen in very much kinds of related areas. I've done a lot of work in credit for prior learning, and I think all too often when you have students who are looking for these kinds of opportunities, whether it be through Workforce Pell, whether it be credit for prior learning, you don't want to have it so that they just accidentally trip over it when they're looking through your website. You need to think about how these students communicate, what the primary channels are. Think like your students and ask yourselves, how will this audience best access this information? And go from there. This has to be, and I think this is a theme that has come out time and again throughout our conversation here. This has to be an entire institutional commitment, and that means your comms team, that means your enrollment management team, and it really needs to be the case that this is front and center on your website to make it so that these students are aware of this opportunity, because I can tell you this, the institutions that are competitive with it, that's what they're going to do. If you have it somewhere buried in your website, you're at a competitive disadvantage.
All right. And Wesley, I want to come to you right quick. When it comes to states, they're scrambling to adopt all of these rules. Are there standout states, excuse me, doing more or less or taking a different approach than others?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen, I mean, I've seen stuff publicly and behind the scenes. Maryland and Minnesota recently put their policies out for public comment. I've been working, like with Kentucky and Rhode Island and many others. I think, you know, again, there's some that I feel like, some of those examples have taken a more strategic approach. Um, some have just, here's all the occupations that meet whatever our definition is. Um, I don't know that there's any that stand out in a good or bad way. I think there's different ways that they've have approached these things. I think a lot of the stuff that I've seen that's been good has been behind the scenes as they're building out, the data systems and the work to identify the programs that might be eligible. And I know that there's like work in North Carolina was doing great work on mapping the programs to, for the credit articulation purpose. And I think, those are really, really good pieces there. Um, but so I wouldn't say there's like any certain ones that are stand out as like the perfect ones yet, at least. And I think most of them have not, done anything publicly because they're waiting on this final rule that just, happened yesterday.
All right. Raphael, we got a question that I want to toss to you. The question is, are there any institutions leaning into workforce pals with a launch this year? I haven't met any institutions that are all in already, someone asked, but do you know of any institutions that's already leaning in to launch this year?
I mean, I think we've all had some conversations, but I don't know if anyone is advertising this at, at the current moment. I would be very surprised and maybe a little suspicious of any institution. It's like we're ready to go come July 1. I'm assuming my assumption is this, and I'm completely surmising here. I'm assuming that there's not a lot of chatter about this because people, to Wesley's point, are like thinking about it and working on it and are like, what are we going to do in this particular regard? So I'm not aware of anybody to be quite candid at this point, nor would I be willing to name them, to say they're ready to go come July 1st. But we know that the door is open. We know that this is a very prescriptive process, and we know that there's a lot of interest for institutions to move into this. And so I know there's even a question there about like we were using WIOA funds, and now we theoretically want to do this one. So there's going to be shifts there as well. It's like, if we could have used this and now it's going to be this, what do we do? Because that is a strategic pivot for a lot of institutions or organizations. So I think that there's a lot of conversations going on behind closed doors in terms of what's going on here. And I think these types of conversations are absolutely essential to help people make decisions in terms of direction. But come July 1, if somebody says, hey, they come through the door and they slap something on the counter and say, evaluate these, we're ready to go from the beginning to the end, I would be very, very surprised if that were to happen, but potentially.
Right. Thank you so much. And we appreciate all the questions. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get to all of them. Wesley, I know we wrap up. You can, in 30 seconds, give me a response, because someone asked, could you use WIORs? And Rafael kind of talked about it, but can you use WIOR and Workforce Pell together? Can you break those funds for one student pathway? If you give us in like 30 seconds.
I think the answer is yes. It's just you have to, it has to meet all the same, the right requirements. And then I want to answer another question that just popped up. That's, how do students indicate that they are in a registered apprenticeship program on the FAFSA? They don't. Students will, complete the FAFSA. They select the institution that offers whatever the institution is that's offering the related technical instruction portion, and that is the Workforce Pell program. That's how the student gets that aid. Students just, FAFSA is an institutional based approach, and then then once they enroll at that institution, that's how the money flows.
All right. Well, this has been a great discussion. And thank you so much, Rafael, Bill, and Wesley, for participating in today's webinar and sharing your insight on Workforce Pell. Before we wrap up, we have a couple of quick reminders. When today's session's end, a short survey will pop up. We really appreciate you taking a moment to complete it, as it helps us shape future sessions. The webinar is being recorded and will be shared out tomorrow by email and posted on CRAF's YouTube channel. In that following up, an email will also be shared the responses that we weren't able to get to live today. Also, you can learn more about CRAF's platform and how we support institutions for employers in managing workforce and work-based learning programs, including programs Workforce Pell may support by schedule or demo with our teams via our website, crafteducation.com. And finally, if you'd like to stay connected on future funding opportunities, grant announcements, or strategy support, you can use our funding QR code right there. Take your phone out right quick, scan the QR code to join our monthly updates and resources. Again, we want to thank everyone for joining us today. On behalf of Craft Education, I'm Robert Owens. We hope you found this conversation valuable, and we hope that you have a great rest of the day. Take care, everyone.